right, welcome back everybody. If this is your first time to the channel, welcome to Notes to Fret, where we are all about turning theory into riffs. And in this video, we're going to jump into something pretty cool. When we have spoken about modes in a lot of other videos in the past, we've spoken about the construction of the modes, the why of the modes, a whole bunch of other stuff. Here, we are going to be diving into the sounds of the modes, as well as actually how to apply them, use them in your own music, create your own music from them. So this is more of a really a functional video rather than a theoretical only video, right? So here we're looking at the tables that we've spoken about in previous videos. At the top we have our major modes, at the bottom we have our minor modes, right? Now in this week's conversation about Lydian, we're going to be talking a lot about chord progressions because that's really where a lot of our musical kind of progressions start to happen, is in our harmony, right? Obviously a lot of melody too, but you know, we always need to talk about, you know, what chords we're putting a melody over. So we need to bring back in our diminished. But I do want to focus in a little bit more on the sharpened aspect of it. And so we'll have conversations about Mixolydian and Phrygian in another video. And here, you know, we really need to look at these chords. And I'm focusing hyper in on that sharp, so much so that we are going to be focusing in specifically this week on Lydian, okay? Now, we have to understand, what does this sharpened fourth mean, right? Now, it's a chord, it's diminished. As a degree in the scale, it's just a raised, right, a raised fourth. That's F to F sharp. But in the chord, it becomes F sharp diminished. So let's look at, you know, what some of the impacts are that we can run into with that. First, we need to understand C Ionian, C major. And we need to compare it to C Lydian, because that's what we're doing here, right? And at the top and the middle, we're going to compare the scales. Down in the lower right-hand corner, we are going to be comparing our chords. And specifically, when we are comparing our chords between Ionian and Lydian, we have to pay attention to this sharpened fourth, right? It's a sharpened fourth in the scale. That means we have F sharp. Okay. What does that do to a lot of our chord qualities, right? That's the next question we have to ask ourselves. And so now we have diminished. And if you look down at the table in the lower right, you'll notice that I have the diminished in there, but I don't have the diminished in the areas in the Ionian or Lydian at the top or the middle of the page. And that's because that are the areas we're going to focus on the scales, right? We just increment a note, F to F sharp. And at the table at the bottom, we are focusing in on chords. Therefore, we have a diminished sharpened fourth or a diminished seventh, right? That would be an Ionian B diminished, right? So we as guitarists, why do we find so much difficulty understanding modes, right? Why even looking at this, is there a little bit of confusion on Ionian and Lydian? I understand they're both major scales, but you know, how do I use them? And I always get confused because it doesn't make any sense. Here's typically, not always, but typically what I have found and what I experienced, because I did this for years. We look, as guitarists, we look at these patterns. We've already spoken about how bad I think this is, but regardless, we look at these patterns and we want musical information, right? But the musical information gives us the patterns. When we look at this, we say it has an F in it. Like, okay, that's Ionian. This is the epitome of a pattern for Ionian. Now, if we want to say, okay, well, what's the pattern for Lydian? Literally, all I do is I move this one note up one fret, right, or a semitone, and I'm now looking at a new pattern, and hocus pocus, this is supposed to magically put me in Lydian. Like, do I just hit F sharp everywhere? To some extent, a little bit, yes. Not entirely, but a little bit, yes. And so when you look at the difference necessarily between Ionian and Lydian, like, how does that become this musical thing? How do I get this strange new feeling with Lydian. Why bother with these modes? What's this crazy thing that's going on, right? And what we need to look at as guitar players, we see this scale pattern, and that's valid, right? We definitely need to have that F sharp, and that really is going to pertain to a lot of our melodies, right? If I'm soloing over a harmony, when do I hit the F sharp, right? But one of the other things that we need to, as we broaden our view of everything that the fretboard has to offer, we also need to look at our chord qualities. Now, if you'll notice over to the right, between Ionian and Lydian, because of that sharpened fourth, it has impact on our chords. For example, you'll notice that the second chord from Ionian is minor, but the second chord in Lydian is major. You'll also notice that the fourth chord in Ionian is major, but in Lydian, it's a sharpened, diminished chord, right? And then you'll also notice that the seventh in Ionian is a diminished chord, but in Lydian, it's simply a minor chord, right? And so that's where this stuff starts to make sense. And if you haven't already looked at the video that I put together on all the modes, but there's one obviously on Lydian as well, I talk about how these chords get constructed and everything else. And that is a video entirely on the modal construction, which I highly encourage you to go take a look at. I just don't want to focus in on it here. I don't want to talk about how these chords are constructed because I want to jump into some of the sounds. But before we jump into some of the sounds, what I want to do is talk about some of the warning signs. And what do I mean by warning signs? What modes, they should be, you know, free flowing. What's the warning kind of about? Here we're looking at C major, right? We've all seen it 1,000,000,001 times. Now, when we look down at G major, down at the bottom, right, we're comparing C major to G major now, right? Totally different keys, but we can look at this and very quickly go, what's the difference between the two? Well, the difference, obviously, in the scale is from F to F sharp. Okay, like fair enough. And then when we add in chord qualities, right, we've got the major, which is C, the first degree is major, the second degree, in this case D, is a minor, third degree is a minor, fourth degree is a major, fifth degree is a major, so on and so forth, right? Now, when we're looking at this, we'll notice that the seventh is diminished. Okay, we've seen that before. I'm going to remove some stuff so I have a little bit more room. And now, in G major, we take a look at this, and the exact same thing starts to happen, right? If we look at this, now our seventh, which is also diminished, that's fine, but we have an F sharp diminished. So when I talk about like hyper uniquely something that is G major, in G major, the sound quality could be, 1, 4, 5. So you go from a G major to a C major to a D major back to a G major. That's absolutely a G major sound. But when I say, wow, hyper uniquely G major, well, the only key that F sharp diminished really resides in is G major. So when you hear that F sharp diminished, your ear's going to say, ha, I'm in G major. So keep that in mind as we kind of progress through this, because that F sharp diminished is very, very, very uniquely G major. So now let's just come over. We're going to jump in. Again, we're looking at C Ionian at the top. And now what we're doing is we're looking at C Lydian down at the bottom. Now here, C Lydian, okay, where are we going with this? Well, interesting, C major at the top has F, C Lydian down at the bottom has F sharp, and the only real difference is this half step, whole step, or whole step, half step combination. And once again, if we're just kind of looking at this as a scale, we say, well, the only real difference is F to F sharp. And most guitarists immediately think melody, right? How do we solo over something? When do I hit this F sharp? But if we bring the chord qualities back into play and we look at that seventh, in this case B, which is diminished, which is, B diminished is hyper C major. So now we're saying, let's bring in the chord qualities, and we'll notice the fourth, right? Now we have the fourth is diminished, and all of a sudden we have F sharp diminished once again. And we just got finished saying that F sharp diminished is hyper focused on saying that I'm in G major. But now we're saying, no. We are in C Lydian, not G major. We're in C Lydian, and this F sharp thing plays a part in my flavoring. So the warning is, how do I prevent Lydian from having the listener go back to G major or E minor? But I don't have to, but I really need to use this F sharp in here. But we already said that F sharp, certainly F sharp diminished, is hyper G major. It's the only place it happens, right? So there's the warning for it. Now, as we look at the circle of fifths, I'm going to go ahead and do away with a lot of stuff that we're not going to be dealing with. We look at the key of C major and we say, okay, what's, hyper unique about C major? Well, there's a couple things, but here we're going, okay, well, B diminished, the only place that happens is in C major. A minor as well, but we'll talk about the minor modes later. If I'm looking at this and I say, okay, if I hear B diminished, the ear kind of goes back, but it sure would be nice to use the B note, right? B chord versus B note, or B diminished chord versus B note. Now, if I come over into G, well, kind of the same thing starts to happen, only now it's happening with F sharp, right? And so I have this hyper crazy thing. F sharp diminished implies that I'm in G major. So looking at, kind of the subtle differences between these two, now that we understand the warning signs, right? We understand that using F sharp diminished, which I want to do in my Lydian mode, can very easily bring me back into G major. We understand where we need to be careful. Now, one of the things that can help us out, right? We're looking at, C major, and we'll talk about the minor modes next week. But here, if I kind of pay attention to the outliers, these outliers also tell me more information about what is more of a C major sound versus more what a G major sound is. In G major, I'm going to have D major. But in C major, I'm going to have D minor. In G major, I'm going to have F sharp diminished. In C major, I'm going to have an F major, right? So we need to take all of these things into account to prevent our Lydian mode from making it sound like G major. And that's what we're going to go ahead and look at now, is understanding how to put this sound together and really look at, we're going to listen to it, and we're going to, see some stuff on a keyboard, because, I like showing you stuff on the keyboard, so it kind of makes you want to go back to your own fretboard and create your own, awesome music. But we'll also see, you'll see plenty of information on here on the keyboard. So that's what I want to go ahead and jump into now. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so what we're going to do now is go ahead and take a listen to Lydian and talk about it a little bit more. And we'll start off with a little music here. All right, so what was all of that about, right? I mean, did this little... Why? Well, what I needed to establish right off the bat was to get your ear very comfortable with this F sharp resolving back to C. Now, why would I need to do that? Well, the nature of F sharp, as we look at the circle of fifths, the circle of fifths shows us that F sharp really wants to come back to that G major. So in order for us to be able to use Lydian, whatever piece of music I'm putting together, right, I need to take that F sharp and get you comfortable here rather than taking that F sharp and making you comfortable. Oops, sorry, hit the wrong key. But just clarify, F sharp, right? And so I need to make certain that where your ear wants to go, this is your ear wants to go from F sharp to G, and I needed to get it comfortable going from F sharp to C. Now, in order for me to do that, I had to do a little bit of voodoo with some sus chords that we haven't gone over yet on the channel. We'll get to that later. But the thing about modes is when we are talking about our kind of outlier, in this case, our sharpened fourth, F sharp, we have to remember where it wants to go, which is G major, right? We see that in the circle of fifths. And we need to make certain that we always establish our mode that we're currently at, right? In this case, C Lydian. Now, the way that we start to kind of look at, keeping our Lydian, I guess, integrity, if you will, is that we need to make certain that we don't bring the listener back into G major by accident. Now, one of the fundamental things with the G major chord is F sharp diminished. That is a chord that screams G major. Virtually the only thing that the F sharp diminished resolves nicely to is coming back to G major. I mean, I guess you can do that as sus chord too. Sounds pretty nice. But the whole thing here is I want to be very, very careful as I'm putting together a piece of music. F sharp diminished, it's fine. I might use it somewhere, like 1 out of every 10 billion bars, whatever. But what I want to avoid virtually at all cost is going directly from F sharp major, or I'm sorry, F sharp diminished to G major. I want to avoid that at virtually all cost. Why? Because that almost is the absolute quintessential definition of the G major key. So just because I don't want to use the F sharp diminished chord doesn't mean that I want to do away with using the F sharp note. Now, one of the other components here, since I'm in C Lydian, I want to be very careful of using B diminished. Why? Because B diminished to C major screams you're in the C major scale. You're in C Ionian, C, right? And we're not in C Ionian anymore. We're trying to say that we are in C Lydian, right? So if we go from a B diminished, that's almost the signature to say that I am playing a piece of music in C Ionian, but we want to go to C Lydian. Right now, how do we do that? Well, if we wanted to use the B, it wouldn't be B diminished anymore, it'd be B minor. And why? Because we've raised the fifth from a diminished fifth to a perfect fifth. We maintain the minor third, no change. But we went from a diminished fifth so that's a very distinct characteristic that we need to pay attention to when we're looking at saying, hey, I'm in Lydian. Let's get that F sharp wherever we can. So what I want to do now is play a very simple chord progression. It's a 1, 2, 3, 5 back to 1. And what I'm going to do initially is play it in the most generic C Ionian way that I possibly can. This is just triads, right? So it's just C to E, G, back to C. Now, I don't know exactly what you heard, but what most people probably heard was that was the happiest ending of a movie or a song that could ever possibly be imagined. Like whoever it was, they fell in love, they lived happily ever after, hocus pocus, everything's good, right? Totally cool if that's what you're going for. But we're going for a little bit of flavor, right? That's why we're using the mode. Now this is why we're using Lydian, because we want to bring in that F sharp. We want to do something a little bit different. So let's listen to that exact same chord progression again. 1, 2, 3, 5, back to 1. Not too terribly dissimilar. There's a few nuances in there. I'm just going to play the 1, 2, just so you can kind of hear it. 100% C major. Lydian. A little bit like, woo, kind of a little bit more, right? So again, C major. C, Lydian. Brightening it up, right? We're getting a little bit of brightness in there, a little bit more. Does that mean it's happier? Well, as you start to kind of progress through this, it will actually start to sound a little bit dreamy, but that's one of the characteristics of Lydian. But what I want to do now is I want to do that exact same chord progression, but I'm going to bring in F sharp every place that I can to really kind of emphasize that I'm not in C major. Instead, I'm in C Lydian, right? So let's go ahead and just kind of take a listen to that. Hearing a little bit more. What I'm going to do now is when I come back to C, I'm going to make this chord a little bit more pronounced. Just going to double up the root and the third. Right? That's all that I'm going to do. Now, when I'm coming back to C, right, you can add flavor. But to me, it's just kind of boring to kind of come back, and so I just, it establishes C a little bit better. But there's no F sharp involved in that. So when I'm looking at Lydian, I can even add one more flavor in the F sharp, and I'll explain it here, right? So let's listen to it first. F sharp. Now here's the thing about that. Why did I use that? When we literally just 2 seconds ago said never go from F sharp diminished to G. Don't do it. But I just went from F sharp to G, back to my tonic. Why did I do that? Like, how does that work out? Right? I literally just said, don't do that, because you'll come back into G. Here's why I did it. When I go from C major to D major, right, and I have that F sharp in there, then I go to E minor, no problem. Then I come out to G, and I go ahead. Why do I hit these F sharps with G? Because now I wind up with G major 7th. However, when I come back to what I've essentially done is I went from my 4th, which is F sharp, to my 5th. Right? We talked about 1, 4, 5, like the most used chord progression ever. But here, my 4 emphasizes that I'm in Aeolian. All right, I'm in Lydian. F sharp, which is my 4th in Lydian. G, which is my 5th. And I could double it up. Do a power chord. So anyways, that's a little bit about how this F sharp, that's the sound. So what I want you to do, now that you've heard it, you've seen it, you see the visuals on the graphics, go pick up your guitar, apply all these same principles, and you'll start to hear that Lydian sound on your fretboard. All right, so let's go ahead and jump back over into the slides. All right, so we looked at that, heard the sound a little bit, and just kind of recap, we were talking about Lydian, right? So we know it's a major scale, and we said C Lydian, so therefore we know that C is going to be C major. Right, we doubled it up a little bit, and this really is more or less your open C major chord that everyone knows and loves. Then what we did is we went into our second, in this case, D major. One of the things that we had to really pay attention to was, let's go ahead and bring in that F sharp, right? Because it's not that we were looking for the F sharp chord, we just wanted to add flavor. In this case, going from C major to D major. And how do we add that? Well, we moved the 3rd up by a semitone or 1 fret. And that gave us our D major, right? And so we want to make certain that we could leverage that F sharp quite a bit. Now, the next one that we went into from our 1, 2, 3 was just an E minor, right? And I'm certain that everybody out there has their own kind of unique way of playing E minor. There was nothing to that, right? Now, really what starts to happen next is when we look at G, a little bit of flavor here. And what am I talking about? Well, if we look at G from C Ionian's perspective, G is a G major, which is the same as C Lydian, but the difference that if we look at expanding that chord a little bit, in C major, the G7th is really a G dominant 7th because it has an F in it. But in Lydian, it becomes a G major 7th, right? And even if you want to kind of double up that F sharp in there, right, you can kind of play around with this, you know, how you want to figure out these chords necessarily. But regardless of that, right, you've got this F sharp a little bit doubled up in there, and you can get some really good sounds. But this kind of really pulls you back into that Lydian perspective, because you're utilizing the F sharp in unique ways, right? You're not just saying, hey, I need to play the F sharp chord. Because if you start hitting the F sharp chord, even if you leave the diminished fifth out, you're still pulling that listener back to G major. But if you can pay attention to where there's other opportunities in the mode to kind of throw in that F sharp, like we were doing here, right, with the G major seventh as opposed to the G dominant seventh, and as well as that, what we did with the D major versus the D minor, right? We don't keep coming back to that F sharp diminished that pulls the listener to G. What we're doing instead is giving that flavor. That now this is where we're leveraging our true capabilities within the mode. So kind of wanted to point that out to everybody. I think it's important to understand how we can use the note F sharp in this case without necessarily driving back to saying, hey, we have to use the F sharp chord somewhere, right? So some of the difference between the scale and the chord progressions. So again, when we're looking at this, I think in this video we did a pretty good job of understanding where that sharpened fourth comes in versus necessarily having to jump into a diminished fourth that's, sharpened. I think, there was a good understanding with that. So that's where, it looks really hyper complex, but necessarily when you kind of break down Lydian compared directly to Ionian and then just find out where you can sneak in that flavor, this table, which in my opinion is a nightmare, this table becomes very simplified, right? So kind of in conclusion on what we spoke about in this video, right? Obviously we reviewed the Lydian scale quite a bit, and as well as understanding how to apply the Lydian mode, right? In order to do that, we have to understand what the impact of our scale is to our chord progressions, right? Those two are not even chord progressions necessarily. That is the case, yes, but chord quality as well, right? Where did the majors change from minor to major, or where did the majors change from major to diminished, whatever it may be. Very important to look at the total picture, right? Not just the patterns, but the big, larger picture. How does this scale affect the chord qualities? And once you start to dive into that, you will start to understand modes a whole lot better. Then obviously we dove into the sound of Lydian. Now again, I know that there's a lot of guitarists out there. Jeff, if it's a guitar channel, why are you putting this stuff on the keyboard? When there is very hyper complex stuff that needs to be shown on the fretboard, I absolutely will. But one of the things that I do want to encourage as much as I possibly can on this channel is to give you all the information so that you have the opportunity to go back to your fretboard and create your own music, right? And when someone shows you how to do something on the fretboard, I do know that we tend to lock into it. So that's why I did it. Let me know down in the comments what you think. But that's kind of where I was going with that. So all of that being said, I really appreciate everybody sticking around to this end of the video. If you've gotten something out of this, please let me know, right? A thumbs up and a comment, right? I love responding to everybody out there. And again, YouTube doesn't charge you. I don't charge you. It's completely free. Huge help to the channel. Smash that subscribe. If you've stuck around this long, you are on a musical path to something pretty awesome. And I think you're driving towards something pretty cool. So with that being said, again, really appreciate everybody taking the time out to view the video. And next week, we will look at this from a minor perspective. And until then, take care, everybody.